So if you go back to when bureaucracy was invented about 150 years ago, there was a certain set of realities at that time. One of those realities was that information was very expensive and hard to move. And so the way you moved information was you had 5 or 6 or 7 people report up to a manager, consolidate it, then share that with another manager. That would then go up the chain of command, get consolidated again and again. Literally, only the people at the top had the full picture. And that's why they got paid so much. And that's why they got to make the big decisions, not because necessarily they were particularly qualified, but they were the only ones who had the full picture. Now, of course, you can move information instantly. It's relatively cheap to acquire and use. And yet we still have, in an average Fortune 500 companies, we still have 8 layers of kind of information processing. It makes literally no sense at all. Once you start to think about that, you go like, okay, well, we need to take that apart.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with management consultant and author Gary Hamel. Gary is one of the world's most influential and iconoclastic business leaders. Gary's worked with leading companies across the globe, is one of the most reprinted authors in the Harvard Business Review's history, and his landmark books, including Bureaucracy and the Future of Management, have been translated into more than 25 languages. During this episode, we discuss the history and evolution of the bureaucratic business management model and the systemic disabilities it leads to in the modern workplace. Gary shares real-world examples of companies he's studied that have successfully implemented radical management alternatives. We talk about how to capture economies of scale and scope through collaboration rather than centralization, and why companies should reconsider their tops-down strategy and instead prioritize employee autonomy and the dissemination of information, accountability, and decision-making. Gary argues that management innovation is one of the most powerful things a company can do to ensure its success. If you enjoy this episode, don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. It was a pleasure speaking with Gary, and I hope we can have him back on again in the future. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Gary Hamel. Welcome, Gary Hamel, to Work for Humans.
Hey, I'm so glad to be here, Dart. Thanks for the invitation.
I have spent the last week really deeply involved with your book, Bureaucracy. I am afraid that in this interview, I'm going to have a hard time getting even close to scratching the surface of the depth of what's there, because I think it's a terrific book, and it's firing on a lot of different levels. But where I want to start is I want to start from bureaucracy, which is very much what your book is about, being the opposite of that. If I'm a CEO or I'm a leader inside an organization, what is it and why should I be worried about it?
Okay, that's a good question. Let me see if I can be as short as I can be. First of all, bureaucracy is like everywhere. It's the standard operating system for how human beings do things together. So whether you are running the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, whether you are running the back office of a bank, whether you're running the army, whatever, we all use basically this thing called bureaucracy. And when you look at it practically, it's really built around a set of fairly simple principles around standardization, specialization, formalization, routinization. But the idea behind it was, how do you bring people together to do really complicated things with ever-increasing efficiency? So this was probably the greatest invention in human history, because all the scientific and technological innovation would have never really paid a dividend if we hadn't learned how to take all that technology and turn it into products and services that we could afford. Henry Ford did not invent the car, even though many Americans think he did. But what Henry Ford did invent was kind of industrial bureaucracy. How do you bring thousands of people together in a highly disciplined way? How do you manage very complex flows of goods and materials so you can bring iron ore at the front end and you have a Model T come out at the back end? And within about 20 years, the price of that car dropped from more than $800 to, I think, around $250. And that was success. So the fact today that we can afford all our digital devices and we can afford to travel around the world and so on is largely thanks to that group of early kind of management pioneers who invented this thing called bureaucracy. So you have to be a little careful in criticizing it because it's given us a lot of wonderful things. And yet, over time, it's metastasized, it's changed, it's kind of developed its own internal self-perpetuating kind of capabilities. So today, what you see with bureaucracy is you often see as an organization grows, and living in Silicon Valley, I see a lot of young companies getting bigger. And as those organizations grow, they reach an inflection point where bureaucracy starts to grow even faster. And that manifests itself as more management layers, leaders who become more isolated. They have more people kind of insulating them from the reality of the marketplace and customers. You need to ask more people to get anything done. The decision cycles get longer. There are more rules to follow. You get more and more staff groups with more and more process that kind of surrounds you and makes it difficult to get things done. There are more and more linkages across units, teams, and so on, interdependencies that you have to manage. Power tends to move up and towards the center, and legal has to sign off on everything. And so as that happens, an organization develops a kind of set of disabilities, if you like, kind of systemic disabilities. Becomes more inertial because in a bureaucracy, nobody ever got shot for saying no. So it's much easier to say no to a new idea than to say yes. So the organization becomes more inertial. You have very powerful individuals running businesses and units that hang on to resources and protect their teams. It gets difficult to realign resources. You find those organizations become less creative because we really don't know how to systematize creativity in the same way we know how to systemize bureaucracy. So creativity is always kind of on the back foot and fighting for time and space and legitimacy in the organization. And I guess, Dart, most of all, the organization becomes less human because you start to look at the human being in a bureaucracy as simply a resource, simply a tool, a means, an instrument that you use to get something done. And so you find that people in bureaucracies really feel like I'm simply a machine or I'm an adjunct to a machine and I don't bring much of my soul, my creativity, my initiative to work. And we can get into the evidence. I'm not merely making assertions here. Behind all of this, there's a huge wealth of evidence that basically says while the benefits of bureaucracy are important, we need control, we need consistency, we need the ability to manage internal collaboration. So while the benefits of bureaucracy are substantial, very discontinuous world where innovation is becoming more important, where people have more choices about employment, the costs are also going up and maybe have reached a point where we have to search for an alternative.
And it also strikes me that one of the things that happens in bureaucracy is that the distance between the people making decisions and the customers can get enormous.
Well, I think that's true. And that's why so often you see bureaucratic organizations missing the future. Because almost always to do something truly new for customers means that you stop doing something or you have to abandon something. And bureaucracies don't like abandoning things. They're basically replication machines. They're built to do the same things over and over again. And so what you end up with is people at the top who built their reputation, they built their power, running the old business model, doing the old thing. And now you're asking them to do something new. And it's very, very hard to do. And by the way, you see this even in really, really successful organizations, right? It's Steve Jobs, clearly one of the most innovative guys that ever lived, but he, was very slow to see the opportunity for streaming. And he thought people wanted to own their music, literally download the file, own the property rights. This is now, I bought this just like a record, even though it's a digital or a CD, even though it's a digital thing. And they got on the back foot with streaming. And that's not a criticism of any one individual, but what it says is that if you have a very small number of people at the top who have a lot of their emotional equity invested in the past, and they're the ones who get to sign off on whether you do something that's new or not, the organization is often going to find itself playing defense, often going to be behind, because the way I try to put it simply is that it's dangerous when the future of an organization depends on the willingness of a small team at the top to unlearn and relearn, because often they'll be unwilling to do so, and then the organization gets caught out by the future.
What does the alternative look like?
The alternative is only slowly coming into view. So I don't want to say that I have one perfect template of what the alternative to bureaucracy looks like. What I would say is we've seen enough organizations that have kind of gone, let me say, bureaucracy free to believe that an alternative is possible. That's an important thing. I mean, I've often been frustrated, maybe you too, Dart, because I know you are always trying to do new things and push the boundaries in the organizations where you've worked. But I've often been frustrated because when you go to leaders and you say, hey, we need an alternative to bureaucracy. We need to fundamentally empower people in a way that's never happened before. We need to build an organization that can change as fast as the world around us. The first answer is always well, who's already done this? And I'm always a little bemused because that's not a question that leaders ask. The guys who founded Google were not benchmarking somebody else's search engine. They said, we have an idea here, let's build something. But nevertheless, I do respect the fact that for many leaders, they're simply not going to have the courage to try to abandon what's familiar without some sense that the alternative really works. So the good news is there's a bunch of organizations around the world, and we kind of describe many of them in our book, that really have radically different management models. And before describing one or two briefly, let me give a sense of what I mean when I say radical. So I think most of our listeners, they're familiar with radical business model innovation. They know that when they, use Google Meet, that is nothing like an old telephone call. They understand like we've just transformed the way we connect with one another. They understand that Airbnb is nothing like Marriott, and that a Tesla with highly autonomous driving and an electric motor is nothing like traditional combustion engine car. We have our heads around that. Not only do we have our heads, we now kind of almost we look forward to that like 10 out of 10 radical rethink of a business and the customer experience. Very seldom do we think that radically about our own organizations. So for the most part, we've grown up in and around organizations that fit that old template. Power trickles down. There are multiple management layers. People compete for the scarce resource of promotion. Big leaders appoint little leaders. Strategy gets set at the top. These things are so familiar to us, we just assume, well, that's the way you manage a large number of people at work. That's the only way to do it. And the truth is there are other ways of doing it, which pay enormous dividends when you look at them closely. So let me give a couple of quick examples. The most innovative steel company in the world, by far, the most consistently profitable steel company in the world is a US company, Nucor. They are built around 75 autonomous steel producing divisions spread across the United States. Every one of those divisions operates as with its own P&L with almost no corporate allocations at all. They have about a third the number of managers that you would find per capita in their competitors. Typical span of control in Nucor would be one manager for about 135 employees. Their head office has about 100 people for a, 20-something billion dollar company. About 100 people. They have no head office HR, no corporate HR, no corporate engineering, no corporate quality, no corporate safety. All of those things have been pushed down to the individual plants. They have a high level of coordination. They are doing hundreds of visits across these plants, peer-to-peer, all the time, benchmarking each other, leveling up their processes. Their frontline teams have incredible autonomy. A frontline employee, these are blue-collar employees. That's what we would call them, blue-collar, but they're very exceptionally skilled, but they can spend up to $50,000 without anybody's permission. They run hundreds of experiments a year designed to improve the business, and they have a big financial stake in the productivity of their own team. So when they raise their productivity, they figure out a way of doing something better. A big part of that uplift shows up in their paycheck. So everybody is united in the goal of building a better business, and everybody reports to the customer. If you have a downturn or one sector is not using enough steel, everybody in the plant, including the blue-collar people, are talking to customers. What else can we do for you? Is there something new? It's really a company where everybody there thinks and acts like an entrepreneur, but yet at enormous scale. A similar example, a company I've been very close to, Haier, the largest appliance maker in the world based in Qingdao, China. They own GE Appliance in North America and other companies around the world. They have built maybe the most radical management model in the world. They've taken the idea of agile teams to like an extreme that most can't even imagine. They've divided in China their 50,000 person organization to more than 4,000 micro enterprises. Each of those little businesses, 15, 20 people, has its own P&L. Each is guaranteed the freedom to set their own strategy, to hire and fire, to distribute rewards. They went from having 8 levels to 3. They got rid of about 12,000 middle managers. They didn't fire most of them. They went to work in these small micro enterprises. And all these little units are tied together by internal contracting. So if I'm a little micro enterprise making a certain model of refrigerators, I need some R&D help. I go negotiate with a micro enterprise that has some smart R&D people in it and ask them to help me build a new sensor. And we write a contract. And if they delivered it and it makes a difference, they get a huge bonus out of that. HR works the same way. They took their corporate HR team from 800 people to 10. The rest of them went out in little micro enterprises, selling different HR services to other micro enterprises that hire. If nobody wants to buy your services, you go out of business. So again, highly distributed power, an organization that is really like a mesh of entrepreneurial units that are constantly swarming new opportunities. And I think if you look at the number of new businesses that they've created, unicorns, ones that have gotten A series, B series funding, they've created more new businesses than any company of their size in the world, I think. But again, a company that has really started the question of what would entrepreneurship at scale look like, and how do you do that? And how do you get the benefits both of all that entrepreneurial energy, but still the advantages of scale? So they're a world leader in Internet of Things, where they need to, those micro enterprises come together and form communities. They have a way of doing that using blockchain and contracting technology to very quickly form communities around bigger opportunities, decide who's going to do what, go tackle them. But it looks nothing like a traditional bureaucracy.
I guess what I want to build out is sort of a prototype unit together. And the reason is I know that different companies are going to have different, I'm going to call them platoons. It's like this idea that there's a subunit which is highly autonomous, that has its own market, that has its own decision-making capability, that has its own business. And so one of the things I see recurring in the companies that you describe is that they break down these units into these pieces. They're all going to break them down differently because they all have different businesses. But I want to talk about what some of the attributes might be. So first of all, how big are the units? And how do you decide? And what's their scope?
Yeah, I've seen everything from probably the small extreme would be higher, 15 to 20 people. A few are larger. I don't think there are any that are more than about 50 or 60. Historically, W.L. Gore, another kind of company that managed in some ways like this, they tried to keep every unit to no more than 200 people. If you go back to the days that Hewlett-Packard was rated as one of the most innovative companies and growing immensely fast, whenever a business got to 200 people, they split it up because that's the limit at which you can actually know other people and feel accountable to them and feel that your voice matters. So I would say 250 is absolutely on the upper limit of what that unit should be. A couple of things these all have in common, wherever we've observed them anyway. One, they all have a real P&L. They're not some kind of synthetic targets about project A, project B, how fast did you get it done, and what are you charging the rest of the company. They have a real P&L. They're buying inputs. There's very few corporate allocations on them. And so people feel like they're really running their business. They'll also have a significant financial upside in the success of that unit. So sometimes talk about ownership as, well, I own a few shares of my employer. Well, that's not what ownership really means. Ownership means I have a meaningful financial stake in decisions which I control. That's what an owner has. And so you'll find that to one degree or another. I think another thing you'll find is that in most of these organizations, they've spent a lot of energy teaching people to think like business people. So if you get hired at Nucor for whatever job it may be in a steel plant, you will go through a week-long simulation where you learn how to run a steel plant. And you learn what capital budgeting is, and you learn what drives productivity and customer satisfaction and all of these things. Because you can't give people authority and power unless you kind of invest in their capability. So what you find them working hard to do is, rather than moving decisions up to where people have competence, they move competence down to where people have information and people are right there on the front line. So I would say that's another feature. So I think that's relatively small, a real P&L, control over important decisions, deep training and how to think like a business person. And with that, real, true accountability. So in many of these companies that I've studied, their wages are actually below industry. Your guaranteed wage is not very high, but a big financial upstake. So 70% of people around the world say they like to work in an entrepreneurial organization, a startup. Well, you should be able to do that anywhere. It shouldn't have to be a giant company to do that. But those are some of I think, the key things you find wherever you see this kind of entrepreneurship at scale.
I'll tell you what this is reminding me of a little bit. It's reminding me a lot of Colonel John Boyd and Maneuver Warfare, which is that you push a lot of decision-making out to the platoons who are out in the field. And you have to push a lot of competence out to that external, to that edge. And you also have to push mission commands out to the edge, which are not just take Hill 5, but why would you want to take Hill 5? There's purpose behind it. There's a reason. But I think a lot about how information flows in that particular situation. And one of the things is very fast decision-making cycle that can respond very quickly to emerging events.
I think it's a student of military history. I won't say I'm a very good student. There's a lot I don't know. But certainly, as we've moved from more conventional warfare to kind of unconventional warfare, the military has had to learn a different leadership and management model, just along the lines that you've said. A lot more flexibility, a lot of people in the field who understand the mission, the broader strategic context, who have full informational transparency to what's going on around them, can make highly informed decisions. But let me pick up on you emphasizing the idea of information, because I think that's kind of super interesting here. I've thought, maybe incorrectly, but I've often looked at traditional hierarchy as an information processing kind of machine. And so if you go back to when bureaucracy was invented about 150 years ago, there was a certain set of realities at that time that mostly aren't true anymore, but certainly at that time influenced how we thought about organization. One of those realities was that information was very expensive and hard to move. And it was all paper-based and didn't travel, no fax machines, telegraph, whatever. And so the way you moved information was you had 5 or 6 or 7 people report up to a manager who would collect their information, consolidate it, then share that with another manager. That would then go up the chain of command, get consolidated again and again. So literally only the people at the top had the full picture. And that's why they got paid so much. And that's why they got to make the big decisions, not because necessarily they were particularly qualified, but they were the only ones who had like the full picture and so on. And now, of course, you can move information instantly. It's relatively cheap to acquire and use. And yet we still have, in an average Fortune 500 companies, we still have 8 layers of kind of information processing. It makes literally no sense at all. And so once you start to think about that, you go like, okay, well, we need to take that apart. And so one of the things you see again at all these hyper empowered organizations is a huge amount of information right on the front lines being used by people to make their own decisions. I remember one of the first times I saw this in action was in a part of General Electric, and they've had an immense hard go over the last few years. But one of the most consistently successful parts of GE has been jet engines. And they're by far the world leader in that business. And I was inside a plant a few years back in Durham, North Carolina, where they assemble the biggest jet engines in the world, about 400 employees and 1 manager, and nobody in between. So a span of control, 1 to 400. But I watched at the end of every shift, teams would come together, multiple teams across the factory. They would sit in a room that was literally covered with data, with screens, with charts, fully informed on exactly what was going on. What are our costs? Where's the shipment delayed? What are the work orders? Where are we running into problems? And so on. And the team would come together to problem solve that. And they had every bit of information that was necessary to run that business available to them. So I think that's what's possible today. We can give people that information. We can put the context around it. We can give them whatever they need to make a smart decision, but there's no reason that information has to travel up 6 or 7 levels. And to your point about being flexible and fast, in a hierarchical organization, you will almost always see very long lags between sense and respond. So people on the front lines will see a shift in customer sentiment. They'll see a new competitor who is doing well. But think about it. Given the scarce time and attention of people at the top, a problem or an opportunity has to be very big to be big enough to capture the scarce attention of the people at the top. And so by the time they recognize that something is a big deal, you are by definition on the back foot. I don't think there's hardly a single industry incumbent that's been ahead of digital technology, digital change. Is that because digital is so complicated? No. It's because it was a really, truly new thing. It didn't fit traditional patterns, molds. And it took a long time before somebody at an EVP or CEO says, we need a digital transformation. Yeah, you did. You needed it 10 years ago. You needed to start then. But the issue wasn't that big. It wasn't that urgent. So if your capacity to change and evolve depends on an issue becoming that big that it captures, then again, as I said earlier, you're always on the back foot. So that's why we need information out of the front lines. We need people able to experiment, try new things. Amazon talks about microservices, small units, testing new things in the marketplace. Presumably Google has its own way of doing that with A/B testing. But this needs to happen not only with like minor changes to a web page or whatever. It also needs to be able to happen with respect to entirely new businesses, right? You shouldn't have to have a board level decision. We're going to explore this new thing and we're going to go see, and like, no, that's just going to be too late. You have to make it very easy for people on the front lines to see an opportunity to pull a team together laterally across the organization, to get a small amount of experimental capital, to go build something, to prototype, try something. That has to be almost reflexive in an organization. Everybody has the freedom, the incentives to do that. rather than either waiting for it to be a strategic issue or putting some isolated incubator somewhere at the fringes and hoping they invent the next big thing. Neither of those two are very good approaches to the problem.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me as I was reading the book is the way in which this distributes risk. That when a company tries to move together as a whole, it's betting the whole company every time that it's going the right direction. And it's a hard object to move around. When you break it up into small pieces, a piece can fail as an experiment, and it's just not that much of a risk. So distribution of risk.
Yeah, I think that's also a really good point. And the way we think about risk, is also pretty interesting and I think often wrong-headed, because there's this sense that innovation is by definition risky. And some of it is. If you're Boeing a decade ago and you're trying to figure out how do you build a fuselage out of composites and nobody's ever done it in the world before, okay, that's just a big chunk of risk. Now, even there, obviously you can experiment and try things, but that's a big chunk of risk. But the reality is that you look at all these startups, how big a risk can you take when you're a startup? Most of them didn't have a lot of capital, didn't have a lot of resources. It wasn't that these were not billion-dollar bets that somebody was making at the beginning. I often say big companies fail big because they can, not because they have to. But what's interesting is if you think about how power and authority over resources, how that trickles down. By the time that trickles down through 7 or 8 layers of managerial sediment, the amount of risk that somebody on the front lines can take is actually very close to zero. So in a typical company, somebody cannot buy a $500 office chair without getting somebody's permission, which is just insane when you think about it. But it's not that we have to give everybody some kind of bet the company capacity, but people ought to be able to take smart business risks. Again, if you're accountable, if you have peers around you that are going to ask questions. One of the first companies that I looked at deeply that's kind of managed in this way is the largest tomato processor in the United States called Morningstar, based in the Central Valley of California. Several hundred employees with no managers at all. The employees all write contracts with one another on how they're going to serve one another. But in that company, everybody has the company's checkbook. If let's say I'm running the boiler that cooks these tomatoes before we turn it into sauce or something else, and I need a new boiler, and that's going to cost $250,000. There's literally no purchasing department to go to, no manager to go to and ask permission. So what have they done? They've taught every single employee how to build a business case. So they've taught frontline, again, so-called blue-collar employees, how to do internal rate of return and net present value. You put together a business case, you go talk to the vendors, you find the best solution, and then you tell somebody in accounting, please write a check. Now, the reason that works in that company and these other companies is, if you get that decision wrong and you cost your little business a bunch of money, that's going to impact everybody's compensation, and they're going to fire you for that. So it's still, you can go do this, but before you make that decision, you're going to show that business case to several of your colleagues and say, hey guys, am I thinking about this in the right way? Did I miss something? Does this seem sensible to you? And then you go do it. So there are consequences when you take risks. There are personal consequences, and there always should be. But I think, again, most companies are willing to do big mega deals and take big multi-billion-dollar risks up here, often on the whim of an EVP or CO, but haven't given everybody the chance to make small, smart bets to build something new. It's completely ass backwards, but that's, again, a product of bureaucracy.
Back for a second to the question of information. How does intellectual property flow? And what struck me about one of the stories about Nucor was the way in which they were all individual units, but they would reach out horizontally for expertise.
One of the really complex things, I suppose, about this is managing a set of paradoxes. One of the paradoxes you come across is the paradox between autonomy on one side and collaboration on the other side, on independence on one side and interdependence on the other side. So it's quite easy to divide an organization up into big pieces if you'd never want them to work together, talk together, and whatever. But then you just have a very fragmented organization with everything at subscale. So the trick, I think, here is how do you think about taking advantage of scale, sharing assets like intellectual property, like code or technology? How do you create a set of incentives where that gets shared very quickly and easily laterally without having to be mandated? So what I would say is, how do you capture those economies of scale and scope, more scope, through collaboration rather than centralization? Because what you'll often find is like somebody in IT says, well, we're all going to get onto the same platform, or we're all going to use the same vendor, or we're all going to consolidate it around whatever that thing is. And often there's a pretty good reason for doing that. But when you do that centrally, what you never see is the costs. So the fact that I had to compromise something that was working very well for me locally to save a buck because we're now doing it, fine, but you don't know how to calculate the aggravation, the pain, the whatever. Now I have to go through locally because now we're all on the same platform. So I think the approach that Nucor takes to that, and this company, this tomato processor, Morningstar, is you build a lot of social density in the organization, a lot of lateral connections. By the way, 3M excels at this as well. So at Nucor, every steel plant is measured on the same metrics. And you can see how every other plant is doing in real time on a whole range of performance metrics. And if you suddenly discover they're doing something better with quality, with energy costs, with labor hours, there's a huge incentive because everybody is paid to build a better business. There's a huge incentive to go figure out what they're doing right. And they have also a very strong collaborative impulse because now they're coming and asking us for time to show them, but next month we may be asking them to teach us something. So they do hundreds of they call it best marking, benchmarking visits a year. But the elapsed time between when one plant figures out something new, the elapsed time for that to go across the network is measured in days and weeks, not months and years. So what it doesn't require is some VP of engineering or something else spotting, they have something interesting there. Maybe other plants should do it. Let's see what we should consolidate on. Now let's ask everybody to do it. So what you find is people collaborate where it adds value and they don't where it doesn't. And I think that's, if you have the right incentives, people themselves will discover where we should be doing things together, where there's a value to collaborate. So back to my story of the tomato processor. As I said, everybody can make their own purchase decisions, buy what they need for their own little part of the company. Well, pretty quickly, people realized that if we coordinated our purchases, we could save some money. We have more bargaining power with our vendors. So they themselves established a little purchasing council that comes together, here's what we're buying. Okay, let's consolidate. And there's no compulsion. You can say no, but they have a mechanism where they can find the opportunities for shared value. And I think that's how this is going to have to work, because the alternative, you end up with very bad compromises that are made with very imperfect information at the center, which tend to overestimate the synergies and the savings, underestimate the aggravation and the loss of responsiveness. It's systematically, they get that wrong. And because, by the way, a big part of moving some of those things centrally and harmonizing them has nothing to do with cost. It has to do with having more control. And so a lot of the decisions that bureaucrats make are not for the benefits of the business. They're for the benefits of accumulating control and power. And we have a lot of data that backs that assertion up. So I think it's much better to create a very deep, rich social fabric in an organization where people have the data and the incentives to discover opportunities for sharing assets and skills themselves.
Who are the cool kids in an organization like this? And I ask that because I've worked in different organizations, and in some of those organizations, the cool kids are management. And in some of those organizations, the cool kids are coders, inventors. And I'm wondering, in these environments, if you've seen a pattern.
That's a really good question. There are, in different organizations, for a variety of reasons, some historical, some probably not necessarily very logical, certain kinds of people get celebrated. So if you're talking to a fashion house, everybody there is going to worship their head of design. And every success gets credited, we have this brilliant person named X who had this brilliant idea and whatever. And so it's the designers who are the cool kids. As you say, in a software company, it may be the coders. In more traditional companies, maybe it's VPs and SVPs and so on. That would probably be true in a big bank. I think of the companies that I've talked about here and some others we could talk about. The cool people are people who solve big problems and people who know how to do really difficult things. So I was originally talking to the founder of Morningstar, and I asked him this question. I said, okay, you have a company with no managers. Immediately corrected me. He said, no, Gary, we have a company where everybody's a manager, by the way. We've distributed the work of managing out to the periphery. So we have a lot of managing going on. We just don't have managers. But I asked him, how does somebody get ahead here? And he said, well, how do you get ahead on the PGA golf tour? You get ahead by being a better golfer. And he said, everybody in our organization knows who are the most irreplaceable human beings. They know who's this electrical mechanical engineer who is just so brilliant and we can't lose Jennifer because that would be awful. And by the way, they have a peer pay setting process. So those people get paid very well as well. They understand we can't afford to lose that person. I think the cool people are people who know how to mobilize resources, how to spot opportunities, how to solve problems. There is still a hierarchy, even though there may not be a formal hierarchy. People know, on any given issue, who's really adds a lot of value or less so. And people aspire to solve bigger problems and to be seen by their colleagues to do so, and therefore be more valued by their colleagues. So I think it's people who get stuff done. And I think one of the most destructive things about bureaucracy is kind of in a business setting, it's a game that is ostensibly focused on creating business value, but really isn't. It's like a game within a game where the game within is often way more important than the real game, which is creating value for customers and shareholders and society. And the game within is basically the game of acquiring power. And so I describe bureaucracy as a massive multiplayer game that's played for the stakes of positional power. And the way you track your progress in a bureaucracy is you climb the ranks. You go from department head to VP, SVP, and so on. And each thing you get more authority and more subordinates and more power and so on and more compensation. The dilemma, though, is that kind of massive multiplayer game, the skills that you learn to get ahead, to win that succession of promotion tournaments, the skills you learn are not necessarily skills that create value. So you learn how to negotiate targets because often you're measured against some internal bureaucratic synthetic target, not against the real P&L and what real customers are doing. So you learn how to negotiate targets. You learn how to hoard resources. So nobody can take my team, even though they may be better, have a higher marginal return somewhere else. You learn how to deflect blame and to manage the optics of your own performance. You learn how to suck up and keep your boss happy. You learn how to elbow rivals out of the way and make them look less competent than they are. And by the way, in a big survey we did with Harvard Business Review, 10,000 respondents, more than 70% of the respondents said that bureaucratic behavior is the primary way you advance in their organization. So you get good at playing that game. And that's great, but that game is destructive. It doesn't correlate very well with creating value. It demeans us. It kind of turns us into assholes if we're not careful. But that's the game that's there in most organizations to be played.
There's another game, which is the game those not high in the organization play to get things done. Who I'm thinking of here is I'm thinking of the work particularly of James Scott. And he studied peasants. And he went out and he looked at the way, this is the book I'm holding right here, Domination and the Arts of Resistance. First of all, you form horizontal alliances of people who are all motivated to get things done. And for instance, you pad your projections of what you're going to be able to get done. So what happens is from above comes this thing, you must get done X. But you know that really X, Y, Z, and W really need to get done. And so what you do is you say that X is going to cost as much as W, X, Y, and Z. And so I think it happens in a lot of spaces.
I think that's absolutely right. It's a very astute observation. To some extent, everybody in the organization is a victim of bureaucracy. But the lower down you are, definitely the more you feel that kind of weight of the layers and the less real voice you have. So you learn a whole set of workarounds to maintain your own sanity, to get things done, not to go crazy. But it provokes, I'm all for rebels and people taking on the system. But unfortunately, it often provokes a very unhealthy version of that, where you really do have to just kind of misrepresent, lie, hide, and so on, because the system around you is so toxic that you can't do the right thing otherwise. We've all had this experience probably with some customer service person who you just got the right person on the right day with the right heart, who knows you're a valuable customer, has no permission to do the right thing, but somehow figures out how to get it done for you without getting fired. And we've tried to look at what that costs in terms of labor hours. And there's at least some reasonable evidence that people on the front line spend as much as 30% of their time simply trying to manage the complexity, get around the complexity, manage the bureaucracy around them, rather than really adding value. So yeah, I have a lot of young friends. A lot of them work in high tech, in companies we all would know. And it's not like the tech companies have figured out how to do this either, by and large. And it can be gruesome trying to get the right thing done there.
I'll tell you though, there may be one way in which tech companies are getting it right. I think it's an important question, which is, have platform businesses created a model that might be closer to humanocracy? And so here's what I'm thinking of. And this is an important question because if I'm a traditional pipeline business, I need to know that I might be competing against a platform business out there who's going to be able to be more agile. And so for the platform business, partially for listeners, which is there's two customers. And one of them, let's say you're selling smartphones. One of them is the people who use the smartphone, but the other one is a developer community. And the developer community is using that platform to reach those customers. But you can have this enormous developer community, which is highly autonomous. In fact, it's entirely autonomous. And that has a very rapid loop in terms of putting something out online and seeing whether or not it's successful. So our platform business is kind of solving this in a way without actually owning the means of production.
I would say yes and no. And let me see if I can qualify that. First of all, I think the idea of kind of like a platform business is immensely powerful, but needs to be thought of in a rather expansive way. I think the number of genuine platform businesses that you think of, Android and Apple iOS or Facebook or Google, whatever, is relatively small. Not every business is going to become a platform business in the sense that you have thousands of developers, you have APIs, and you provide all the tools for them to create. You're basically a duopoly at best. I just think there's a limited number of businesses that are going to have that character. Now, if you just abstract one step back and say, do you need to think about how you leverage and harness immense amount of resources that are outside of your boundaries? Hell yes, no matter who you are. So today when Hire develops a new product, and they think of themselves very clearly as a platform business. The last book, 2 books ago, I wrote The Future of Management. I basically made that argument that every large company was going to have to become much more like a network, like a platform, not thinking about it in so much of a technical sense, but just in how you see resources around the world as things to leverage. So at Hire, every new product that they think about, or almost every new one, starts as an open initiative on the web. So they're sharing on social media, on other platforms. Here's what we have in mind for a new air conditioner. Do you think this works? What are your pain points? They will have often millions of people following a new project, and they will show them multiple prototypes. They will sometimes crowdfund the early prototypes. So they're right out there in the wild. Everybody else can see it. Likewise, when they have very difficult technical problems, they have a large community of problem solvers around the world, and they built a problem sharing platform where people can come and they can say, hey, we don't know how to build this kind of a turbine fan for our air conditioner. Do you guys have any ideas? So in that sense, yes, I think the battle is not simply to produce an organization that's more innovative internally. The battle is, how do I harness as much of the world's relevant knowledge, creativity as I can? And how do I become the most attractive place for that to show up? And there's some very sophisticated things that you have to do for that. So for example, at Hire, if you want people to share ideas on how they might solve your problems, you need to have a kind of an IP bank that people know they can share that. Their IP is safe there. Hire's not going to run away and commercialize that and so on. I mean, there's some very interesting technical challenges to solve. But I would 100% agree that every business needs to think about its boundaries as being highly permeable and ask itself, let me look at the world as a reservoir of knowledge, creativity, and resources. And how do I build a business where I can tap into as much of that as possible? That's, I think, super, super important. And not to get too hung up in, do I have to do it in the way Google, Facebook, Apple, whatever's done it? Because maybe not. Great examples. But if you let that limit your thinking, you're going to miss maybe the bigger opportunity. By the way, let me add something there, Dart, because the question you asked, this is basically originally what got me thinking about management in a different way. I've been a student of open source software for a long time. Literally since probably it was a thing, since back in the early 90s when Linus Torvalds was first working on Linux and then watching GitHub get invented and so on. And what struck me is, you'd see this is the most ubiquitous software in the world, used on more devices than anything else in the world. It has, in some sense, Linux at its core. The most recent version, I think 25 million, something like that, lines of code, created by about 15,000 volunteers. Many of them working for other companies, but also getting paid to work on this. And you go, okay, all of this thing got created with nothing that looks like a traditional bureaucracy. And by the way, if you look at almost every new major software project, they all start out that way. I'm not going to call it the data, but I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of projects are now being hosted on GitHub, but this is how people now create. That was Linus Torvalds' greatest invention. It wasn't Linux, it was probably GitHub. And so I looked at it and said, okay, we have a platform where people can come together to work on really complicated things. And I started asking, how do we do that to change the way organizations work? What would it look like if in an organization you asked 70,000 people, how do we take out bureaucracy? Or how do we become more transparent? Or how do we become more experimental? And you were asking all those people to hack the organization and run small experiments and build better code, if you like, right? Better organizational processes, because like this just seems to make sense to me. This is the way change has to happen. How do you create the infrastructure and the tools that allow many, many, many people to come together and work on things that are really complicated? And why I like Linux probably even better than I like an iOS. iOS, you have all these different apps, and some of them connect through APIs. You can access the same, but it's really not one thing working together. And the challenge, if I'm a very large integrated company, is, yeah, I can split things up, but at the end of the day, it still also has to work together somehow. So I need a form of collaboration that isn't just dividing things into parts and saying, you could list everything. They all have to reconnect at some point. And I think there's a lot to learn from open source, not directly, but through analogy of how you solve really difficult problems using that kind of collaborative approach.
Yeah, what's so interesting about that is a purely intellectual property play, that is an example of how intellectual property can be shared across completely uncoordinated communities and become architecturally sound. It's an incredible story. It's one of those stories that if I hadn't seen it happen, I would have said it was impossible. It's an amazing thing. I really appreciate the idea that GitHub might be the innovation, like the biggest innovation that there was there.
I've never met Linus Torvalds. I'd like to meet him at some point, but I'll give you a direct quote that struck me. And again, there's a tension here, and I'm not sure he's right on this, but by articulating one side of an argument, he forces us to think about something. So he said this. He said, don't make the mistake of thinking you can design something better than what you'd get with a massively parallel trial and error process with a feedback cycle. So don't think you can design something top down, elaborate it, make it perfect. That's better than if you just, I think one of the expressions is, with enough eyes, all bugs are shallow, right? If you just let enough people look at it. And he finished by saying, that's giving your intelligence too much credit. And I think this has been the fundamental problem with so-called organizational change or change management, which is like the ultimate oxymoron, change management. Because in most change programs, I'll give you an example. I was talking to an executive, very senior executive in one of the largest, most respected tech companies. They have a huge sales force, thousands of people in their sales force. And he told me they'd recently reworked all of their compensation, rolled out a new compensation model. I said, how did that go? He said, it produced enormous backlash. He said, we had so many people pissed off and we had great people leaving, and now we're got to dig ourselves out. I said, well, tell me how you went about that. He said, well, we worked with consultants. And I said, well, did you blog about this first? Did you invite people together? Did you run a hackathon, let people tell you what was working and not working with how? He said, no, that would have taken too long. And so he said, instead we had consultants in and we just rolled this thing out in 3 months. By the way, time to implementation is not the same thing as time to success, because now you're going to spend a year making up for trying to take a shortcut there. I really believe that just given the complexity of the world, given the speed, there's less and less that can be designed top down. I mean, some things still can, for sure, but less and less that can just simply be designed top down. And when you do that, you're not harnessing the ingenuity of the organization. So you don't know what options you never even saw. You're likely to come up with solutions that often don't work because you're just not down on the ground seeing what's different in different places. It's unlikely to have a lot of political legitimacy because the process by which it was created is pretty much opaque to the rest of the organization. So you're going to spend a lot of time overcoming just natural skepticism. So the approach we take when we're trying to help companies embrace this idea of humanocracy is, hey, let's get tens of thousands of people engaged. We'll teach them about these core principles. What does transparency look like? What does meritocracy look like? Whatever. Okay, given that, what would you change the way we hire, lead, compensate, organize? We'll get thousands of little hacks. We'll do peer review around them. We'll take the best of them, turn them into experiments with clear hypotheses, nothing longer than about 90 days, nothing very expensive, see what works, scale it up. In many situations, that is going to be a more viable approach to change, particularly when you're dealing with complexity, than let's get all the experts together. Let's spend a year studying this thing. Let's rewrite it from the top down. Let's roll it out across all these unsuspecting people. Like we know from the big consulting companies that fewer than a quarter of that sort of change process works. And like they keep trying to think of like, how can we increment it and make it a little better? No, if it's failing 70% of the time, like we just need to like start over again. And I think it's going to be something that is much more like open source, or what I would say it's socially constructed change. And it's change that trickles up rather than trickles down.
So let me say something about how I manage my organization. First of all, to show the sort of flexibility I have in my organization is that I saw an opportunity that I thought that there was for an internal service, a service that the rest of the company would value. And I was able to essentially start it up with very, very little friction. So I said, I think we should start this. And somebody said, great, do that. No headcount, but yeah, check it out. And so essentially built it up and it became a service inside the organization. And I run my org as an inverted org chart so that it's got me at the bottom and then branches that grow up, because I feel like that inverts the power structure. And the growth is at the top, and the leaves up beyond are probably our clients who are also growing. And so the question that keeps happening is, as I push my management so many responsibilities out to the tips of the leaves, I end up with less and less to do. And what remains is what's left. And at some point, I may just simply become an individual contributor. I may dissolve my management role. That's a possibility. But the question remains, is there anything left? I'll tell you what I see as some of the things that I do, which maybe should not be called management anymore, is I'm an account manager, which is my job is to win the kind of work that my team wants to do and is uniquely qualified to do. And so that's still there. There are occasionally needs to be a tiebreaker in situations, which is, are we going this way? So perhaps purpose and values come from me. I wonder, as these things are given away, if ultimately there's nothing left, or if there are some things that a manager still has.
It's a really, really interesting question. I would start by saying the work of managing is never going to go away. If you kind of think of managing and not management as a set of layers or a particular group of people, scheduling, planning, optimizing, mobilizing, resourcing, coordinating. I mean, we do these in our personal lives. Every one of us is like a manager of our own life and some of our children's life and perhaps and whatever. So that's always going to be there. The question is like, who does that work? And again, just a little history is useful here. So if you go back to the early Industrial Revolution, the majority of people coming to work, as we started to scale up and have really big organizations, the majority of people coming to work were illiterate. So you needed to have these kind of very well-educated individuals to wrangle all these now thousands of people, to set out the deadlines, to collect the best practices, to make sure people were showing up on time, to make sure they got the right training. And so we invented this thing called a manager. Now, in some sense, they existed in time immemorial. You always had hierarchies, you had supervisors and so on. There's biblical references to this that goes way back. Having said that, we invented this new thing called a manager. And Peter Drucker spent his life talking about the work of the manager. And business schools got created. First Wharton in the late 19th century, then a bunch of others in the 20th century. Business schools got created to kind of train this new genre of employee called a manager. The question is, do we still need them in a world where, as I said, information is readily available to everybody, in which most people are not illiterate, quite the opposite? And what is, to your exact question, what do they do? I think that is yet to be determined. I think that if you look at managing or leadership, which is a very fraught term, we can talk about that separately if you want. But if you look at that, you will find in any organization, there's some people that others simply want to follow because they have a vision, because they always make work exciting, because they build you up, because they have something to share with you, because they help you grow in some kind of way. I mean, there are always these individuals who are going to attract followers irrespective of their positional power. And we could look at those individuals and say, like, what do we have? And how do you help other people aspire to the same thing or build that kind of what I would call a natural leadership capability? You started something in your organization without a mandate, without a budget. You were a natural leader. And often, when I'm talking to like so-called leaders, SVPs, EVPs, and so on, I'll ask them this question. I'll say, if we took away your positional authority, if we took away your right to hire, fire, and make big decisions, if we took away your resources, what could you get done? And if the answer is like, I'd be helpless, I wouldn't know what to do, I'd say, that's great. You're not a leader. You might be a bureaucrat, but you're not a leader. A leader is somebody, in my definition, is somebody who can get things done irrespective of positional power. They know how to mobilize people, how to excite people, how to work around the corners, how to free up resources. That's what a leader does. Leader is not somebody who runs project review meetings and wrangles budgets and whatever. That's a bureaucrat. Maybe we need some of those. I don't think so, but maybe so. There's always going to be room for natural leaders in organization. And we should always be asking, how do we help people develop that? I think the challenge for traditional managers in this new model is, though, what you said. What am I going to do? So we tell the story in the book about Michelin, more than 100-year-old tire company, largest in the world. They did a very interesting project in empowerment that was not top down. They did it with volunteers. One fairly senior leader went around the world talking to frontline supervisors and recruiting, I think in the end of 37, 39, I won't remember, but that kind of number, volunteers who said, I'm willing, with my little team as a supervisor, I'm willing to spend the next year trying to learn how to give away my power. They didn't tell them how to do it. There wasn't some big program. This thing just was an idea. Why don't we get a bunch of people together and figure out what does it mean to lead and be a manager when you're giving away your power? So they had 30-some people do this over a year. They stayed loosely connected together. And at the end of the year, almost all of the individuals, all of the supervisors says, my life has gotten better. Nobody wakes me up at 3 a.m. because there's a line problem that they don't feel like they have the authority to solve. I'm not sitting here worrying about vacation schedules because the team is doing that now, and a whole variety of things like that. What I'm doing instead is I'm helping those people get the resources to tackle bigger opportunities. I'm giving them personal coaching on how they can move up or learn new skills. So I'm doing work that is much more rewarding. And Gallup has interesting data on this. Gallup found, by the way, employees are not very engaged wherever you look. And companies' internal statistics are pretty much bullshit on this. You can't believe what a company tells you about how many employees are engaged because they're not honest about it. But if you look at Gallup's data, and this is true even of very well-managed companies, about 30% of employees in America say they're fully engaged in their work, and the rest aren't. And so when they look at managers, particularly middle managers, it's even worse. And I think a lot of the reason you think, why would that be? Well, managers are getting it from both ends. They're still an employee. They still have to put up with, 5 or 6 layers. And now you've put me in the role of being a surrogate parent to adults, where I'm having to micromanage and follow up and do all of this stuff. And 13-year-olds don't like being treated like 13-year-olds. And sure as heck, 20, 30, 40-year-olds don't like being treated as 13-year-olds. So I think the reality is for many, many, many managers, when you move to a more empowered organization, their jobs get better. And not all can make that transformation, for sure. If really you are at heart a core bureaucrat and that's what gets you off and that's the only skill you have and you're not a natural leader, well, you probably shouldn't be in the organization. You should be in a tech role, something else. But I think a much flatter, much more empowered organization, you'll need as many leaders. In fact, you probably need more leaders than you had before, because now you got to have a lot of people who are smart enough to make important decisions, smart enough to run a little business as if it's theirs. But there's going to be less room for just managing other managers.
Yeah. My team is entirely made of leaders now.
Yeah. And isn't that cool? Isn't that the most exciting thing to get to that point?
It is. And you're absolutely right that it's a very pleasant way to manage. I help to illuminate the landscape of opportunity on 2 dimensions. I help to illuminate it across our markets, where can we expand our markets and where can I go out and play a role in actually creating relationships that can help us to expand our market inside the organization. And then the second one is laying out a lattice of what are the potential range of services that we might consider. And this is just an idea starter because I'm not going to choose which of those services we're going to deliver. We might test the market and we might decide which ones we're going to test. And then what are the overlaying that, the sort of the opportunity of what services we could provide is what capabilities might we need to gather to ourselves to be able to provide those services. I feel like it's more like a map making exercise to help the team who hasn't been all over the map themselves before see what's possible.
Exactly. You have to decompose the various aspects of what it means to be a leader. Because what you're describing is very much how I would see a leader. A leader is somebody who solves problems and spots opportunities. And usually those all come together, right? An opportunity is always just a new and interesting problem to solve. And a bigger leader is somebody who spots and solves bigger problems. and is recognized to do so. And by the way, that's when you know you're a leader, is when people choose to follow you, not when somebody gives you a title. If you start to decompose, well, what does it take to do that kind of work? What does it take to move from A to B, to solve something new, do something new? You find a set of skills. You have to be able to look over the horizon, anticipate what's coming next. You need to be pretty good at analogies and learning from other industries and saying, hey, has that problem been solved somewhere else? You need to be pretty good at finding talent. Who around here might have some knowledge that would be helpful to do that? You have to be pretty good at finding resources and go and scraping around and finding some money to get started. You have to be pretty good at negotiating the internal bureaucratic hurdles and clearing those out so people have a run at it. You have to be pretty good at communicating that opportunity to other people. Now, very few individuals have all of those skills. The ones that do maybe end up as successful entrepreneurs and start a company and see it to X billion dollars and whatever. Like, okay, that's great. But most people don't have that full complement of skills. And I think one of the mistakes in our organization today is, as they become more centralized, which they have, we're putting a burden of leadership on a few people at top that almost nobody's equipped to carry. It's no criticism on them. It's like, how many people in the world can hit a golf ball 300 yards? Not very many, much less win the US Open. So you need to recognize, what part of that am I good at? And how do I find people that bring those other problem-solving building skills that maybe I'm not so good at? But I think that's what it means to get ahead, is you just get to solve more interesting, more consequential problems, and you get to work with more interesting people, and you get to have a bigger impact on your organization. And you don't need somebody else to tell you when you've done that, really. You don't need like some stripe on your shoulder or something else to say, atta girl, atta boy, like you like got the next stripe here. You feel it, and there's great satisfaction that comes from doing that. So it's kind of amazing to me. I go into these organizations and I look at their leadership development programs. They're all completely stratified, right? It's like the first level is like young people, it's like leading yourself. Then it's like leading a project team. And then there's leading a business unit. And then it's like leading a division. It's like they've reified the whole organization in even the way we talk about leadership, which is kind of reify that hierarchy, the way we talk about leadership, which is pretty stupid. No, leadership is a set of skills. Some of them you can learn, maybe you can't, about getting things done with other people that make a difference. And I want those skills everywhere. And I want people to be recognized for it everywhere. And I never want somebody to feel like I have to play a bureaucratic game to become a leader here.
Yeah. And one of your points about how we expect too much of leaders, I find that there are a lot of leaders who are very afraid. And they're afraid because they become responsible for something, and we're putting responsibility on them for something that it's impossible for them to do.
Yeah.
Last question is on management innovation. One of the challenges of management innovation is that we are operating on ourselves. Sometimes the way I describe it is it's like tinkering with the jack that the car's on while you're under the car. And sometimes it feels like, I think it was in Master and Commander in the movie, where the doctor has to operate on himself and he has to remove a bullet with a mirror. It's like that. And so it can be scary. So I guess the questions are, what are the limitations on management innovation, and see what they are and avoid them?
Yeah, boy, it's also a very, very thoughtful question. First of all, just recognizing that there is something called management innovation is an important step, because I often talk about a hierarchy of innovation. I'm not sure it's exactly a hierarchy, but I'll describe as levels. So kind of at the bottom, I have product service innovation. I'm building a new widget, gadget, something or other. Okay, that's not too hard. Probably going to get copied fairly quickly. Above that, I have some operational innovation. I'm improving back office systems, something like that. Probably I'm doing that by outsourcing, buying it from a consultant. That may give me a little more advantage. We'll see. A layer up from that, I have like strategy innovation, where I'm inventing something new, like a new business, and I had to think of the whole thing, and that's probably going to be fairly difficult for somebody to duplicate. A level up from that, we have kind of like platform innovation, a PayPal or something. Okay, now that's pretty hard. That's going to be, and then at the top, I would argue, is management innovation. And when you go back and you look, as we've done, if you study industrial history over the last 100 and some years, and you look at the companies that, by the way, not all of them are still successful, but if you look at the ones that enjoyed long periods of success, like GE, like IBM, like Procter & Gamble, they all spent a lot of time thinking about management, not managers, but thinking about management systems and processes. How do we reward people, and how do we set strategy, and so on? And they were constantly innovating around those things. And we take all this stuff for granted now, but at one point, capital budgeting was a new thing. pay for performance was a new thing. Kaizen and continuous improvement was a new thing. Everybody invented those things. And most of the inventors profited. And what you discover is when you invent new kind of social technologies that dramatically expand the capability of a team of people to do something, that's a good thing. And it's often complicated, and it often takes your rivals a long time to figure out what you've done. It took the American car industry more than a generation to figure out what Toyota had done with continuous improvement. Because at its core, it was the redistribution of power, which, let's not go there until we absolutely have to. So first, you have to recognize that it's important. And you have to say as an organization, all right, we put all this energy and innovation and A/B testing and doing this new gadget and widget and whatever. How many leaders are actually responsible for innovating in management? Where are we experimenting with fundamental new ways of compensating, hiring, promoting, allocating resources, creating strategy and whatever? Where is that innovation going on? So I think, first of all, you have to say, okay, maybe we need to get good at it and be explicit about this and encourage people to do it. And maybe every single manager, if nothing else, what they need to be doing is experimenting with management and helping us accelerate the pace at which we can evolve our underlying management model. I go back to my starting premise. Today, almost every organization you look at, even what we see as the very well-managed companies, they all suffer from a set of systemic disabilities. They all tend to be inertial. They struggle with ahead of the curve change. They all tend to be incremental. They often struggle with game-changing innovation. And in many ways, they're kind of inhuman, and they're just not getting the best out of people. And there's all the data around that. So there's some pretty substantial problems we have to solve. And those problems are only going to be solved by kind of rethinking this bureaucratic model and innovating around management. So I would say that's first. I think second, you have to recognize that we're probably at a point in business history where we need not just better processes and practices, we need better principles. So you reach a point, whether it's in technology or any other area of human endeavor, you reach a point where you cannot move forward without new principles. You get to the end of what a PC can do, and you make an architectural jump to something called a smartphone, whatever the analogy you want to take is. And I think that's where we are in management. And so if you're going to innovate in management, you have to say, I probably need to start with some foundational principles that are different from specialization, standardization, the ones I inherited from the industrial age. Because we've been trying a lot of new things in organizations, most recently agile teams. And I can tell you, agile is not going to make a big difference because nothing in 60 years has made a big difference. In the companies that have been at it a while, you see bureaucracy already overtaking it. Most of the ethos is gone. The language is still there. It's kind of a little nudge in the right direction, but it's not very radical. It doesn't really redistribute power very much, or it doesn't change the compensation. So at some point, you have to go back to principles. And that's why in Humanocracy, the core of the book is really talking about a new set of principles around experimentation, meritocracy, openness, transparency, and so on, and arguing that you have to start to say, how would you operationalize those principles if you took them seriously? So once you start thinking like that, you get some pretty radical ideas. So for example, if most companies tend to overinvest in the past, why don't we open up the capital budgeting process and we let the crowd decide where to fund things? That's a pretty flipping radical idea. And most CEOs would have a heart attack if you kind of say, let's go do that. So when you have a radical idea, and I think we're going to need lots of them, then you have to ask, how do I test that at a really simple, low cost way without blowing things up? One of my arguments has been, you have to have revolutionary goals. We have to work to imagine organizations that look very little like the ones we're in right now. And you have to get there one step at a time, without blowing anything up, without kicking the jack out from underneath the car. And so the way you do that is you hack. You run small. I'll give one example. This was in a large pharmaceutical company, very well run, but bureaucratic. And a group of kind of middle-level managers were whining about the company's travel policies. So in this company, you had to get permission, even as a fairly senior person, a permission to take a business trip. They told you which airlines were our partners, which hotels to stay in, how much you could spend every day. And then all of this is audited afterwards. And then somebody writes you a note saying why did you spend this? And they said this is just infantilizing. It's costly. It's stupid. So they ran an experiment, literally with an A group, a B group over a few weeks. The treatment group, we said, travel anytime you like. You want to fly first class on Emirates? That's okay. You just we don't care. Collect your receipts. We need them for taxes, but just do whatever you like. By the way, we're going to publish all of your travel expenses online where all of your colleagues can see them, but there's no rules. Well, interestingly, travel costs go down, satisfaction goes up from that little, and you're testing the hypothesis that transparency may be a more powerful control mechanism than bureaucracy. Turns out, in that case, it was. So many leaders have had such a terrible experience with like transformation. They've spent billions on consultants. It's taken years. It hasn't produced results. It's been disruptive to the organization. And it's just like, don't come and tell me we need to like reinvent the way we manage. Save me. Gotta say, no, you don't. You can't do it from where you're sitting. But what we want to build is a portfolio of hundreds of small, low-risk experiments where people are trying stuff, like self-approved travel. And then we'll see if it works or not, and we'll scale up the things, and they'll have plenty of evidence, and we'll scale it carefully. I guess here's a bottom line for your listeners. I believe, given that so many organizations suffer from these same disabilities, I believe very deeply, Dart, that the most successful organizations over the next 10, 20, 30 years are going to be the ones that evolve their management models faster than their competitors in ways that make them more resilient, makes them more creative, makes them more inspiring places to work. And I believe that's a race. You may not recognize it as a race, but just as like 20 years ago, a race got started on how do you digitize your business. That race is now mostly over. I mean, now you're either in that race and you're keeping up, you're gone. So that race, like we know. And I think now we're having a new race, which is not about digitizing the business, it's about humanizing the organization. And the starting gun is kind of going now. So I think that's the pace at which you can evolve is going to determine whether you're around in 10 or 15 or 20 years. The second thing I would say is winning that race is largely about building this capacity for continuous low-cost management innovation. It's really going to be like evolving anything else that's big and complex. It's simply the number of experiments that you run, how quickly you run. Jeff Bezos said years ago at Amazon, he said, my goal was to create the world's biggest laboratory. And I think they've just tried more things than anybody else, and some failed, some worked. And the same thought that they brought to how they evolve their retail model, we have to think about that as how we evolve our management model. And I think that's what is going to distinguish the winning and not so winning CEOs, I think, over the next few years.
It's very inspiring. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure, Dart. Thank you for such provocative questions. And also being kind of a real live example of somebody, you're kind of a proof that something I've long believed, that a lot of people have a kind of learned helplessness in organizations. They actually believe often bureaucracy is a bigger foe than it is. And what you discovered is if you have a kind of noble cause, if you're doing something that just like people are going to say like that's right, if you're fairly selfless about it, if you kind of go sideways and find some natural allies, you get all kinds of things done in an organization. You can whine and moan and bitch about it, or you can start to hack something. It's really up to you. But I appreciate you being an example of that.
It's absolutely true. I am always telling people you have way more degrees of freedom to act inside an organization. Sometimes it's subversive, admittedly, and sometimes it doesn't have to be subversive. In my current organization, it didn't have to be subversive. I just said, I think I should do this, and everybody said, okay. But in the past, I've done it subversively, which is also fun to do. It's fun to just do something that's against the grain, but people do have a lot of freedom to test the edges. I agree. Well, thank you. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure, Dart. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.